In the spring of 1941, a German test pilot climbed into an aircraft unlike anything the world had ever seen. No propeller, no piston engine. Just two turbojets mounted beneath swept wings, a pressurized cockpit, and a tricycle undercarriage that made every other warplane on Earth look like a relic. He 280 lifted off the runway at Rostock-Marion and entered history. The war was barely 2 years old. The Spitfire and the Messerschmitt Bf 109 still ruled the skies. And yet, here was Germany, already flying the future. So why did no one stop them? Because the men who could have deployed this aircraft chose not to. And that decision may have cost Germany the air war. By 1939, Ernst Heinkel had already built one of the most consequential aircraft programs in aviation history. His company, Heinkel Flugzeugwerk, had produced the He 111 bomber that rained destruction on Warsaw and London. But Heinkel himself was looking further ahead than bombs and propellers. He was obsessed with speed, with jet propulsion, with the idea that the piston engine era was ending, whether the Luftwaffe leadership believed it or not. The timing was not accidental. In the late 1930s, aeronautical engineers across Europe and Britain were beginning to grasp what jet propulsion could do. Frank Whittle in England was already developing his turbojet concepts. Germany's own Hans von Ohain had been working independently along the same theoretical lines. Heinkel hired von Ohain in 1936. That decision would ignite a revolution. The He 280 was not born from a Luftwaffe requirement. There was no official order, no strategic plan handed down from the Reich Air Ministry. Heinkel funded the initial development privately, driven by competitive ambition and genuine engineering conviction. He believed jet-powered fighters would define the next generation of aerial warfare. He intended to be the man who built them. What followed was one of the most extraordinary aviation stories of the Second World War. A story of brilliant engineering, political obstruction, institutional jealousy, and a jet fighter that arrived before the world was ready to use it. In the spring of 1941, a German test pilot climbed into an aircraft unlike anything the world had ever seen. No propeller, no piston engine. Just two turbojets mounted beneath swept wings, a pressurized cockpit, and a tricycle undercarriage that made every other warplane on Earth look like a relic. He 280 lifted off the runway at Rostock-Marion and entered history. The war was barely 2 years old. The Spitfire and the Messerschmitt Bf 109 still ruled the skies. And yet, here was Germany already flying the future. So why did no one stop them? Because the men who could have deployed this aircraft chose not to. And that decision may have cost Germany the air war. By 1939, Ernst Heinkel had already built one of the most consequential aircraft programs in aviation history. His company, Heinkel Flugzeugwerk, had produced the He 111 bomber that rained destruction on Warsaw and London. But Heinkel himself was looking further ahead than bombs and propellers. He was obsessed with speed, with jet propulsion, the idea that the piston engine era was ending, whether the Luftwaffe leadership believed it or not. The timing was not accidental. In the late 1930s, aeronautical engineers across Europe and Britain were beginning to grasp what jet propulsion could do. Frank Whittle in England was already developing his turbojet concepts. Germany's own Hans von Ohain had been working independently along the same theoretical lines. Heinkel hired von Ohain in 1936. That decision would ignite a revolution. The He 280 was not born from a Luftwaffe requirement. There was no official order, no strategic plan handed down from the Reich Air Ministry. Ernst Heinkel funded the initial development privately, driven by competitive ambition and genuine engineering conviction. He believed jet-powered fighters would define the next generation of aerial warfare. He intended to be the man who built them. What followed was one of the most extraordinary aviation stories of the Second World War, a story of brilliant engineering, political obstruction, institutional jealousy, and a jet fighter that arrived before the world was ready to use it. The road to the He 280 began not with the fighter itself, but with a smaller, more experimental aircraft, the Heinkel He 178. On August 27, 1939, 5 days before Germany invaded Poland, test pilot Erich Warsetz flew the He 178 from Rostock-Maria airfield, becoming the first person in history to fly a turbojet-powered aircraft in level flight. It was a milestone that should have shaken the foundations of military aviation procurement. Instead, when Ernst Heinkel personally invited senior Luftwaffe officials to witness a demonstration, they arrived late, watched briefly, and left apparently unmoved. The apathy was staggering, but Heinkel refused to stop. Even as the He 178 was proving the concept, his engineering teams were already designing something more ambitious. The He 280 would be a genuine combat fighter, two-engined, armed, fast enough to intercept anything the Allies could put in the sky. The lead engineering effort drew on the expertise Heinkel had accumulated through the He 178 program, with aerodynamicist Robert Lusser contributing to early design work before leaving for Messerschmitt. The aircraft took shape through 1940 with a shoulder-mounted wing configuration, a smooth fuselage optimized for jet propulsion, and critically, a tricycle landing gear rather than the conventional taildragger layout. That was not a trivial decision. Tricycle gear was unusual for German aircraft of the era, but it was the right choice for a jet, providing better ground handling and forward visibility on takeoff. Heinkel's engineers understood that jet aircraft demanded different thinking from the ground up. The He 280's power plant was the Heinkel He's 8 centrifugal flow turbojet, a direct descendant of the engine Hans von Ohain had been developing since his arrival at the company. 2 of these engines would be mounted in nacelles beneath the wings, feeding the aircraft thrust without a single spinning propeller blade. The configuration was elegant by the standards of its time. It was also deeply problematic. The He's 8 was chronically unreliable, prone to flameouts, and difficult to bring to full rated thrust consistently. Jet engine metallurgy in 1940 was in its infancy. The materials available to German engineers simply could not withstand the temperatures and stresses that sustained high-powered turbine operation demanded. This would haunt the program from its very first powered flight. The first prototype, designated V1, flew as a glider in September 1940, towed aloft to evaluate the airframe's handling characteristics before any engine was fitted. That was a cautious, methodical approach, and it revealed real issues with the tail design that required modification. The aerodynamic work continued through the winter, and on March 30, 1941, test pilot Fritz Schaefer took the He 280 V2 aloft from Rostock-Marien on its first powered flight. Both He's 8 engines were running. The aircraft flew. What Schaefer experienced in that cockpit was unlike anything a German military pilot had felt before. The acceleration was different, smooth and relentless, rather than the sudden surge of a piston engine at full throttle. The noise signature was different. The vibration was different. The aircraft climbed quickly, responded cleanly to control inputs, and demonstrated a top speed that the Luftwaffe's frontline Bf 109 simply could not match. Early estimates placed the He 280's top speed at approximately 800 km per hour at altitude, figures that, if achievable in production, would have made it one of the fastest combat aircraft in the world. But the He's 8 engines continued to cause difficulties. Thrust levels were inconsistent. Individual engines could surge or lose power without warning. Operating both engines together at matching thrust settings was an art form rather than a procedure. It had placed enormous demands on the pilot's attention at exactly the moments when attention was most critical: takeoff, climb, and combat maneuvering. The engineering teams worked continuously to improve reliability, but the fundamental problem was one that could not be solved quickly. Germany's industrial and metallurgical capability in 1941 was not yet equal to the demands of jet engine production at the power levels the He 280 required. Through 1941 and into 1942, the prototype series continued. 9 He 280 airframes were ultimately constructed. though not all flew. And the test program generated a remarkable amount of data about jet-powered flight in a combat aircraft configuration. The aircraft was equipped with a pressurized cockpit, an advanced feature that acknowledged the altitudes at which jet aircraft would eventually operate. It was armed, at least in prototype configuration, with 3 MG-151 autocannons mounted in the nose. On paper, this was a formidable weapons package. In practice, the aircraft never fired its guns in anger. One of the most significant moments in the He 280's history had nothing to do with its engines or its armament. On January 13, 1942, test pilot Helmut Schenk was conducting a flight when ice accumulation caused the control surfaces to lock. The aircraft became uncontrollable. Schenk reached for the ejection seat handle because the He 280 was equipped with a compressed air ejection seat, one of the first operational ejection systems ever fitted to an aircraft, and fired himself clear of the stricken machine. He survived. The aircraft did not. It was a dramatic demonstration that the He 280's designers had anticipated the possibility that jet aircraft might become suddenly and completely unmanageable. And they had prepared accordingly. Schenk's survival was not luck. It was engineering foresight. But engineering foresight could not overcome institutional resistance. The Luftwaffe's leadership, under Erhard Milch and ultimately Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, was not enthusiastic about jet fighters in 1941 and 1942. Procurement decisions were dominated by immediate frontline needs. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 had entered service and was performing well. The war in the East was consuming enormous quantities of conventional aircraft. Development resources were finite, and the jet engine programs both at Heinkel and at Junkers, where the Jumo 004 axial flow turbojet was under development, required long-term investment for uncertain near-term return. Milch in particular was skeptical of Heinkel personally, and the rivalry between aircraft manufacturers in the Third Reich was savage and political in ways that had real consequences for procurement decisions. There was also a competing jet fighter program. Adolf Galland and others within the Luftwaffe were increasingly interested in the Messerschmitt Me 262, which was being designed around the Junkers Jumo 00 for a more powerful and ultimately more practical axial flow engine than the Heinkel He 8. The Me 262 would take longer to develop, but its projected performance was higher. And it had the advantage of being associated with Messerschmitt, a company with considerably more political capital than Heinkel in 1942. The He 280 received a moment that should have changed everything. In a remarkable documented test on March 22, 1943, an He 280 was pitted against a Focke-Wulf FW-190 in a simulated combat exercise. The result was unambiguous. The jet outmaneuvered and outran the propeller-driven fighter in every engagement. The He 280 was demonstrably faster. It was the clearest possible evidence of what jet propulsion could mean for German air superiority. It was not enough. The Reich Air Ministry evaluated the He 280 program and made a decision that aviation historians have debated ever since. In March 1943, the program was officially canceled. The stated reasons included the inadequate thrust of the He 8 engine, concerns about range and fuel consumption, and the parallel progress of the Me 262 program. There was logic in each of those arguments individually. The He 8 was genuinely problematic. The He 280's range was limited. The Me 262 did eventually prove to be a superior aircraft, but the cumulative effect of canceling the world's first operational jet fighter prototype in 1943, just as Allied bombing campaigns were beginning to strain the Luftwaffe's defensive capabilities, was to delay Germany's introduction of jet combat aircraft by more than a year. The Me 262 did not enter operational service until the summer of 1944. By then, the strategic situation had deteriorated catastrophically. Had the He 280, with whatever limitations it possessed, been pushed into production in 1942 or early 1943, It would have encountered Allied bombers at a moment when the Luftwaffe still had the pilots and the infrastructure to use it effectively. Whether it would have changed the outcome of the air war is a question that history cannot answer. What is certain is that the opportunity was surrendered. Ernst Heinkel watched the decision with bitter frustration. He had built the world's first jet-powered aircraft. He had designed the first pressurized jet fighter. He had fitted the first ejection seat. His company had pioneered every critical technology that jet aviation required. And the aircraft that embodied all of that work was canceled before a single one flew a combat sortie. The 9 He 280 prototypes were eventually scrapped or lost to Allied bombing and the chaos of the war's final months. No complete example survived. What remains are photographs, engineering documents, technical reports, and the testimony of the men who flew and built the machine. One reconstructed example exists today in the Deutsches Technikmuseum in Berlin, rebuilt from documentation and surviving components to give visitors a sense of what the aircraft looked like. It is, in a sense, a ghost, the physical form of an opportunity that was never taken. After the war, Allied intelligence teams combing through German aviation records encountered the He 280 story and recognized its significance immediately. The USAAF and Royal Air Force had been developing their own jet aircraft, the Bell P-59 Aerocomb in America, the Gloucester Meteor in Britain, but neither had matched the He 280's performance or the timeline of its development. The realization that Germany had flown a combat-capable jet fighter in 1941, while Allied pilots were still flying Spitfire, Mark Vs, and early P-40s, was sobering. The margin between Allied victory and a very different air war had been, in part, a product of German bureaucratic dysfunction. Hans von Ohain emigrated to the United States after the war and eventually worked at the Air Force Aerospace Research Laboratories at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, where he made further contributions to jet propulsion research. He and Frank Whittle, the two men who had independently invented the turbojet engine on opposite sides of the conflict, eventually met, and their conversations about parallel discovery became one of the more remarkable moments in the history of aviation. Two engineers separated by a war who had each glimpsed the same future from different directions. Fritz Schaefer, who made the He 280's first powered flight in March 1941, survived the war. The aircraft he had flown into history was gone. The program he had helped prove possible had been canceled. But the technology had not died. Every jet aircraft that has flown since, every airliner, every fighter, every machine that moves through the air on turbine power carries the direct lineage of the work done at Rostock-Amirian in those early, uncertain years of the war. The He 280 never fired a shot in combat. It never intercepted a bomber. It never appeared in the combat reports of Allied aircrews who might have encountered it over Germany. It existed, briefly and brilliantly, as a demonstration of what was possible, and then it was set aside by men who could not see far enough. History has a way of remembering both the aircraft that flew and the decisions that grounded them.